Alright guys, so I got another comic related video here today because I have in my hands Alphacore #1 from Rippaverse Comics, which this is of course cover A, which was done by Joe Bennett, who is also the interior artist for this book. So this is our third release from Rippaverse Comics, and the first release that is actually not ASUS, so a brand new property here. Now, we were introduced to these characters briefly in both ASUS #1 and #2. However, this is the first time we're actually seeing these characters more in depth with their own story. Now, we are going to get into spoilers on this book. However, before that, I will just give some spoiler-free general thoughts on the book. Which, starting as usual with the quality, this is the same great quality that we have come to expect from Rippaverse products. A great paper stock. The physical book itself is very good. And one thing to point out is that this book is actually cheaper than the other books that we've gotten from them so far, which is something that Eric has talked about wanting to improve on in the future, is getting the prices as low as possible. Which this book is, I believe, 96 pages, so it's roughly the same size as ASUS 1. However, this book only costs $28. While both issues of ASUS costs $35 apiece. So we got a 20% reduction in price while maintaining the same great quality. So that alone is a big victory for them, I would say. Now, story-wise, this book is about the Alphacore, which is a special wing of the police department that is made up of Excepts, who are used to combat Except threats. So whenever there's a criminal who has powers and the regular police can't handle it, they call in the Alphacore and use them to get control of the situation. So we're seeing the story from their perspective, and there's a big conflict with them and the rest of the police where they want to be more than just, brute muscle that's called in when they have to be used. They want to be more involved with the actual police work and the detective work and actually solving and preventing the crimes as opposed to just being used as, basically a blunt force instrument. So we get to see that dynamic between the Alphacore and the rest of the police. We get to see the dynamic between the three main members of the Alphacore itself. And we also get introduced to a lot of villains in this, some major villains and some minor ones. We also get a follow-up on the cliffhanger we had in ASUS #1 with Michael Copper and Lillian Ronashi, since they actually end up being the main villains of this book. So it was cool to see them again, as well as all the new characters we were introduced to. This book did go a long way in world building, as far as fleshing out the city of Flores Park and the police departments and just kind of the goings-on of this part of the world. Now, this book was written by Chuck Dixon, who is a veteran of the comic book industry. He's worked for DC and other big companies before. Now, like I mentioned in some of my previous videos, I'm not a real long-term comics guy, so I actually wasn't familiar with Chuck Dixon's work. So this was my first introduction to him, and overall I was impressed. I do absolutely recommend this book. I think the story was good. I think the characters were interesting, and Chuck's method of storytelling really just pulled me in and left me wanting to see more of this group and more from this series. So with that being said, at this point we are going to get into spoiler territory here, so if you want to read this book and not be spoiled on anything, you have been warned, because we are going to get into the contents of the book here. So, first thing right off the bat, we immediately dive into the action, because the first thing you see when you open up the book is a shot of a dude holding a gun to a woman's head and robbing a bank with a bomb strapped to his chest. So, immediately we dive right into the action, which later we learn that this bank robber is named Cecil Moreno. So he's robbing the bank. He's got the whole police force lined up outside trying to get control of the situation, which is not going very well since he's threatening to blow up the whole place. So at this point we have Brian Solari, the leader of the Alphacore, come flying in. So Brian is an accept. He's a very Superman-esque character, I guess you could say, at least in terms of his powers. He can fly, he's bulletproof, he has super strength. He's also a veteran of the war that was alluded to in ISOM number 2, where Texas broke away from the United States. So we got a little bit of that in this book, though not very much, but it was mentioned. So anyway, Brian swoops in and saves the day and takes out Cecil and sets off his bomb vest up in the sky so no one is hurt. So he flies down and hands over Cecil to the police, and he gets into an argument with one of the police officers named Flynn about how they didn't call for him to come in because this wasn't an accept threat and this was outside of his purview. So, you know, that's our first look at sort of the dispute between Alphacore and the rest of the police force. So then we cut to a scene with Michael Copper and Lillian Ronashi, which are the main villains of this book, who we were introduced to before briefly in ISOM number 1. So they're having a conversation about how Cecil was working for Michael Copper, and the bomb was supposed to go off inside the bank to destroy some dirty money that was stored there that could have linked them to some of their shady dealings that they've had going on. So this was all Michael's plan, to destroy some evidence, and obviously it didn't go well since the bomb didn't go off in the bank like he was hoping it would. So Lillian is kind of fussing with him about that, about how he needs to clean up his mess. So then we cut away again to Brian returning to Alphacore's flying base, which, again, we saw that very briefly in ISOM number 2, but we get a much better look of it here, which is really fucking cool. So Brian returns there. We get a look at the base, which is referred to as the Eagle Nest. And we also meet Ray and Sandy, which are 2 new characters who are part of the support team for Alphacore who work in their base. We also meet the second main member of Alphacore, who is Ingrid Valdez, when she is the newest member of the group. She is also an accept. We don't really know much about her powers. She does have these cool sort of like laser whip things. I'm not totally sure if those are physically part of her body or what. But she can use those as weapons. But we see her and Brian, and they kind of get into a fuss about Brian being all over TV about, you know, stopping the bank robbery. And we're also introduced to another new character, who later we learn is named Ridley Van Essen, who is a lawyer, and he's sort of going on the media and talking about how, you know, the Alphacore is stepping out of line, and, you know, it's making the citizens nervous that these super-powered police officers are being too brutal and coming in and using their powers against non-powered criminals, and, you know, it can be a threat, and, you know, it's stirring up distrust among the public for the Alphacore. So anyway, they argue about that for a bit, and then we get an actual Alphacore call from the police where they are dealing with an accept, and they do need Alphacore's help. So it cuts to elsewhere in the city where the police are trying to make an arrest, and we're introduced to one of our new villains, who is named Galvin, aka Meth Gary, which, if you know, you know on that one, that's all I'm gonna say. So anyway, Galvin's fighting with the police, and he's an accept that has electricity powers. He can control electricity and use it as a weapon. So he's fighting the police, and the Alphacore ends up sending their third member to help, which is Braxwell, which is another guy with powers similar to Brian's, where we know he can fly, we know he has super strength, but again, we don't know much else about his power set beyond that. We do know that Braxwell wears a helmet, and he is sort of the strong and silent type. He's not totally mute, but he speaks very little in this book, which makes it very effective when he does actually say something. So Braxwell ends up showing up on the scene, and he rolls in and just fucking rider kicks Galvin right in the face, which I thought was hilarious. So he takes out Galvin and then smashes a water pipe in order to douse him with water and short-circuit him, basically, so the police can arrest him. So next we have a brief scene where we see Cecil again, the bank robber from earlier, at one of the police precincts, and he's being interrogated by the police. And to his surprise, his lawyer shows up, and his lawyer turns out to be Ridley Van Essen, the lawyer we saw on TV earlier, bad-mouthing the Alphacore. So he shows up, and then it immediately cuts away to another scene where we see Brian at the police department headquarters, which is referred to as the barn. And Brian is meeting with Chief Holcomb, the head of the police, and Holcomb is basically just chewing him out for, not following the rules and only coming when Alphacore is called. So the chief basically just tells Brian to, keep Alphacore under control and to keep a low profile until, the media quits complaining about them. So then we go back to Ridley, meeting with Cecil, and he's just talking to him, asking him what he's said to the police and everything. And, Cecil's talking about how he was told that bomb was a fake, which obviously it wasn't. So Ridley just tells him to keep his mouth shut and that he's got to go meet with his other client, who is revealed to be Galvin, the electric guy who just got arrested earlier by Braxwell. So we learn here that, Ridley is sort of the link between all these goings-on, and Ridley is also working for Michael Copper. So he's the one that set up this entire situation. And then we have a scene with Galvin in the prison where he actually gets a hold of one of the guards and uses the guard's taser to charge himself up, which allows him to bust out of prison and go to Cecil's cell, and he actually ends up using his powers to kill Cecil. And we have some really cool artwork of Cecil's just fried corpse. So that was really cool. So Galvin ends up murdering Cecil and escaping from prison. And we see, again, both the Alphacore and the regular police wanting to investigate this, and some more tension between them, where the regular detectives don't want the Alphacore to be involved with the actual police work part of the process. They just want them to come in, when they have a fight to deal with. So at the end of this scene, Brian ends up going off to investigate the bank again, while Ingrid Valdez teams up with another new character we meet here, which is a young detective named Wilkins. So Ingrid and Wilkins go off to research a list of known associates for Galvin. So then we have another scene with Lillian once again chewing out Michael Copper, to where, she learned about his plan to have Ridley tell Galvin to murder Cecil to try to cover up his connection to them. But it's really just exposing them more since, Ridley and Galvin are now linked to them as well. So she's chewing him out for, making the situation worse. And he ends up telling her that he's already called another guy that's going to take care of it this time. And we're introduced to Copper's new henchman, which is this backwoods redneck guy named Billy Bob Quinn, who we see off in his trailer somewhere getting woken up by his grandmother spraying him with a fucking fire extinguisher. So that was pretty funny. It got a laugh out of me. So Billy Bob is woken up by his grandmother and told to get going to the bank. And Lillian ends up telling Michael to, call off your guy and I'm going to handle this instead. So next we have a scene of Lillian's guy coming in to try to take care of the situation, who is another new character who later we learn his name Benny, which he is a very, used car salesman is the best way to describe his look. He is an accept, and he does have some sort of hypnotism powers that I believe is based on his voice. So basically, if he tells someone to do anything, they'll be manipulated into doing it. Sort of a Lelouch Code Geass-esque sort of power. So anyway, Benny goes into the bank and meets with the bank manager and wants him to open up one of the boxes that, has Michael's money in it. So he ends up taking the money out of the box and replacing it with a mysterious envelope. So meanwhile, we still have Ingrid and Wilkins, and they're out still investigating Galvin's known associates. And they're having a little conversation about how, they should give Ingrid a car since she's the only member of the Alphacore who can't fly. And Ingrid ends up kind of taking this the wrong way, and she sort of snaps at Wilkins, and there's one panel where she yells at him that she's not a comic book character, which got a laugh out of me. I thought that was pretty clever. So they end up trying to investigate one of the names on the list, who is Samuel Lewis Montana, who we never actually see in the book, because when they knock on the door, no one answers. And we get the big reveal that Wilkins is actually an accept who has metal manipulation powers. So he uses his powers to open the lock on the door, and they go inside and find Galvin hiding in there, who immediately attacks them. So then we cut away again to Brian back at the bank, trying to talk to the bank manager, and Billy Bob Quinn comes walking in, and he ends up revealing his power since he's an accept too, and he can turn into this sort of like lava fire guy. So he transforms and tries to rob the bank and gets into a fight with Brian. So we have this really cool back and forth fight scene where it's cutting between Ingrid and Wilkins fighting against Galvin, and then Brian fighting against Quinn. So it goes back and forth between them for a while, and with Wilkins' help, Ingrid manages to take down Galvin and toss him out of a window into a dumpster to incapacitate him. And meanwhile, at the bank, Brian actually ends up not faring as well against Quinn, and Quinn actually takes him down and goes into the vault to try to get what he thinks is the money out of Michael's lockbox. So the bank manager winds up actually slamming the vault shut on him and locking him inside. So then when Quinn uses his powers and lights up, he actually burns up all the oxygen in the room and causes himself to pass out. So that was actually a pretty clever way to take him down. So next we got an important bit of world building here, because we had a little scene where Ingrid was talking to Wilkins and apologizing to him about snapping at him earlier, now that she realizes that he's an accept as well. And he's explaining that his powers only rate a 2 on the Schuster scale. So the Schuster scale is apparently some sort of in-universe measurement to measure how powerful an accept is. And Ingrid mentions to him that you can actually move up the scale if you train with your powers, because apparently your powers kind of work like a muscle. So the more you use them, the more powerful they can become. So that was a very important little tidbit that they snuck into that conversation there that can apply to pretty much any accept in this world. So anyway, the police end up taking both Galvin and Quinn away to jail, and Brian ends up getting the envelope that Benny put into Michael's lockbox. He gets a hold of that and takes it back to the Eagle's Nest. So then after that we get another scene of Ridley. He's on some sort of news program where once again he's on TV trash-talking the Alphacore. And after his appearance, some detectives show up and want to ask him some questions, since they realize that he's involved in the whole situation between Galvin and Cecil. So he sort of blows them off and goes into the bathroom. And once he's in the bathroom, we see that Benny is in there waiting on him. So the detectives wait on him outside the bathroom for a little bit, and they realize he's taking a while, so eventually they go inside and discover that Ridley had jumped from the window to his death on a car several stories below. So Ridley obviously got manipulated by Benny into committing suicide here, as part of Lillian's plan to clean up Copper's mess. So next we cut back to the Eagle's Nest, where we see the Alphacore, and we actually get a brief glimpse of Braxwell without his helmet on. So they're talking about the contents of the envelope that Brian got from the bank, which turns out to be a flash drive. And Brian wants to put the flash drive into their system and find out what it does, and of course they're telling him, we have no idea what's on this, anything could happen. So anyway, in the middle of all this, they get an Alphacore call from the detectives, who have kind of realized that, Benny was there when Ridley died, and he was also at the bank earlier today. So they realize that he's involved with this, and they go after him. And they learn about his powers, so they call in the Alphacore for assistance. So they send Braxwell, and they tell him to be sure that he preps properly to deal with his abilities. So anyway, Braxwell shows up at Benny's house, and Benny tries to use his manipulation powers on Braxwell, but it doesn't work, because Braxwell can't hear him because he's blasting music in his headphones, which I believe is a real song. I think it's a Dr. Dre song. That's not my kind of music. I'm more of a Kamen Rider Girls man myself. But yeah, I believe that is a real song. So anyway, Braxwell shows up and duct tapes Benny's mouth shut to arrest him. And then they get attacked by some of Benny's associates, who are these two big thug guys, at least one of which is an Accept with like a big scaly dragon arm. That looked pretty cool. So anyway, Braxwell ends up fighting them off, and they all get arrested as well. Meanwhile, back at the Eagle's Nest, we see Brian still wanting to try out the flash drive that he got, and though everyone is telling him that it's a bad idea, he ends up sticking it in the computer anyway, which, of course, immediately infects their entire system with a virus. And Sandy tries to remove it, and she gets electroshocked by it and sent flying across the room. So this virus ends up infecting their entire system, and they actually lose control of the entire Eagle's Nest. When it's revealed that this was, again, all part of Lillian's plan, since, she had Benny leave that flash drive in there as bait for them. So now Lillian has remote control of the Alphacore's entire base, and she ends up setting their flying base on a collision course with the barn. So she's going to take out both the Alphacore and the police department all in one fell swoop. So then we have this really cool action sequence where Braxwell realizes what's going on, so he flies off to try to help, and both Brian and Braxwell try to work together to physically stop the Eagle's Nest from falling out of the sky, which they are not strong enough to do. So they end up abandoning that and trying to rescue some people who are endangered by some falling debris where the Eagle's Nest had ran into some buildings and stuff. So they end up saving some of the civilians. So then it cuts to the barn where we see they are evacuating to try to get out before they all get crushed by this giant base landing on them. So they're all evacuating except for Wilkins, who we see. And Wilkins realizes what's going on, and he thinks that he can put a stop to this. So Wilkins goes out and he actually uses his metal manipulation powers to slow down the momentum of the base and actually bring it to a stop before it collides with the barn. So Wilkins ends up being the big hero of the day and saving everyone on both the Eagle's Nest and in the barn. However, he massively strains himself way too hard in the process since, like we mentioned before, his power level wasn't that high. So he overexerted himself so much in doing this that he actually ended up dying. And we get a scene of Alphacore, finding his body outside and then going to his funeral. So our man Wilkins sacrificed himself to save the day in the end, which was definitely something I didn't expect. It seemed like they were setting up Wilkins to be, some sort of character that would, slowly grow over time into eventually maybe becoming a hero of his own or joining Alphacore or something. But yeah, they had him have a big heroic moment and then just killed him off right off the bat. So R.I.P. Wilkins. So then lastly, we did have one little scene right at the end of the book where Lillian and Michael are leaving on a private jet, and Alphacore shows up, and they sort of confront them and tell them, we haven't been able to connect all the dots yet, but we know you're behind this, and we're going to get you eventually. And then Ingrid actually ends up using her whips to fuck up their plane, and Brian ends up telling her, she's going to have to be the one to explain this to the police chief. So overall, that was the book. Like I said, I did like it a lot. I thought it was a very interesting story. It definitely pulled you in. It had great action scenes. It introduced a lot of cool new characters. Both Galvin and Quinn, I especially like them as villains. They definitely had a sort of, villain of the week kind of feel. So I hope we see some more of them, in their henchmen antics in the future. Overall, this book did definitely feel kind of like an episode of a cop show, sort of mixed with maybe an episode of Justice League Unlimited or something like that. So it was very much a cool mix between police drama and superhero antics. So I definitely enjoyed that. It did make me want to see more of this. It does very much sort of have an episodic feel, so it feels like, we could have this series go on for a very long time. and easily just have a lot of content for it. So I was very happy with this book. A few negatives. Again, I mentioned this in my ISOM number 2 video, and I will mention it again here. There were a few minor art inconsistencies. Not very many. I feel like there was less in this book. But I did notice a few things, mostly with like people's outfits and stuff. Like, I know, like, in one scene, one of the detectives was wearing a tie, and then in, like, the very next panel, she wasn't. So, you know, little things like that, but when you notice them, you know, it kind of sticks out to you. So, that was still a thing. And then also, really, my biggest complaint with this book was actually a little bit of the characterization for Michael Copper. Because, at least to me, Michael came off, like, completely incompetent throughout this entire book. Which, I don't know if that's what they were aiming for the character or not. But it's definitely how it came across to me, because he basically just spent the entire book doing these failed plans that really just made things worse. And then Lillian had to come in and clean up his mess every step of the way. Which, I really liked Lillian. I thought she was cool as a character. I thought that, you know, she was very strategic and ruthless in her plans. We didn't get to see much of her powers. We didn't get to see much of Michael's either, for that matter. All we really know is that, you know, Michael's eyes can glow green, and Lillian can manipulate some kind of purple energy with her hands. Which we knew that much from their brief appearance in ISOM 1. So, these characters are still largely a blank slate. So, I don't want to go, you know, too hard in on them yet. We do definitely need to see more of them. We need to see the scope of their powers. We need to see more about, you know, what sort of dealings they're actually involved in. But from what we've seen in this book, it did kind of leave me just wondering, like, what is Lillian even getting out of this partnership? It seemed like she was doing all the heavy lifting, and Michael was just there, you know, fucking stuff up. So, yeah, I don't want to, like, you know, shit on it too much, because we haven't seen much. But based on what we've seen, it definitely left me wanting as far as Michael's character goes. So yeah, outside of that, I did have a very positive impression of this book. I definitely am going to continue buying future entries in the Alphacore series, as well as pretty much everything from Rippaverse, because I've been a satisfied customer all 3 times I have purchased from them. Which, speaking of which, the next campaign is going to be Yaira number 1. I believe that is going to be launching sometime next month. I think that's what they're aiming for. Which, as of this recording, the Alphacore number 1 campaign still has about a week or so left on it. So if you want to get in on that, you do still have a little bit of time. Of course, even after the campaign ends, at least one cover of the book is going to still be available on their store. So you can pick that up at any time if you want to read it. But yeah, I will be grabbing Yaira as soon as it becomes available, and I will be doing a video about it as well when I read through it. Which, also, this isn't related to the Rippaverse, but I also have Razor Fist's Ghost of the Badlands comic pre-ordered, which I believe that is fairly close to fulfillment. Should be sometime in the first part of this year. So, whenever I get my hands on that, I'm probably going to do a video covering that book as well, because I'm actually pretty excited for it, too. But anyway, yeah, I guess that's all I got to say. So, lots of luck to you and yours.